Shalom, shalom, friends, and welcome and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Unapologetics, where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. This is actually going to be excuse me. Get some echo back from myself there. My apologies. This is actually going to be an open room, as you can probably see by the title here. It's actually going to be the second or third open room that we have done in the last 2 weeks. Kind of enjoy these open conversations sometimes. Although I do want to say that it is going to be slightly more, I guess, structured than they have been. I always wanted my open rooms to be a little bit more, I guess structured is the best word to use. Because I don't like the yelling over each other and the cussing and the people feeling like they're being insulted and stuff like that. And I have let a couple of times that happen on this channel in these live rooms. Once with Rage was arguing with somebody, and I can't remember who it was. And then most recently with Danny and Jim. And by the way, just for the record, I mean, me and Rage have our back and forth, but both Danny and Jim I actually enjoy talking to a lot. So I'm not talking any sort of ass or anything like that, right? I'm just saying what happened. So I want to make sure there is a little bit more structured rules, just following the rules that I've always wanted anyways. But nonetheless, shalom, guys. Thank you for being here. Like I said, this is just an open room, open topic. I do have something I want to talk about a little bit that could potentially jumpstart. But if anybody has anything that they want to talk about, the link is in the description. And I also just threw it into the live chat. I'm going to go ahead and stall for time a little bit while we wait for people to show up, though I do see Guru Lady and Honesty Angel. Shalom, and thank you both for being here. I'm going to go ahead and say a brief prayer, actually, since this is one of our unapologetics, and that's how we start these off. So if you'd like to join me, I'd certainly recommend you do so. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for having the opportunity again to come and do these videos, Lord Jesus. I pray that this conversation is fruitful, Lord, and I pray that it is for nothing more than the glorification of you and your kingdom, Lord Jesus. I pray that you have your Holy Spirit here anointing us, Lord Jesus, to make sure that we have good revelation and good knowledge, Lord, and just things that bring us in closer relationship with you, Lord Jesus, to reveal your truth. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's holy name and give you the glory. Amen. Excuse me. So a couple brief announcements, of course, because it's the start of a show. Number one, I do have an interview next week with Bruce Gore. Many of you may know Bruce Gore. He is quite popular here on YouTube, roughly 30,000 subscribers. For those of you who do not know who Bruce Gore is, he is actually a historian. He teaches an adult Sunday school, you could call it, because you do teach it on Sunday, class going through church history and history of the Bible, right? And so it goes through like the Enuma Elish and the Code of Hammurabi and the historical context of Abraham and the patriarchs and David and so on and so forth. And excuse me, he is one who would take a conventional understanding of the Exodus, meaning that he not only believes that the Exodus occurred in roughly 1450 BC, the exact date commonly given is 1446, but also Bruce Gore takes a conventional understanding of the chronology on the Egyptian side. And now those of you who know me know that I am a adherent to the new chronology, right? I think that David Roll, the man who we just actually had in our on our interview most recently, which, by the way, if you did not check that out, absolutely do. It's one of, if not the best video of unapologetics ever. So definitely check that out. Unapologetics number 92. Might actually throw a link of that into the live chat if I want. Not sure. Actually, shalom, Sam. Slam, excuse me. I see that you're here. Sorry, I just got distracted by that. Good day to you as well. At any rate, so Bruce takes the conventional ideas both ways, right? 1450 BC, traditional for 1450 BC, because conventional, the modern consensus would actually be the Ramses date, right? But he also is somebody who takes a conventional chronology. So he would be placing the Exodus sometime around the reigns of either Thutmose III or Amenhotep II, both pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. And he's not going to be providing any sort of a refutation or anything like that. to anything that Dr. Roll gave us in episode 92. He's just simply going to be presenting the case for what happens if we take a straightforward look at biblical chronology and a straightforward look at the modern conventional Egyptian chronology and just overlay them with each other, right? And so that's what we're going to get on the 22nd. If you guys are interested in that, I think it'll be absolutely fantastic personally. So I would recommend it. And especially given the fact that this is kind of becoming a theme, and I think I'm going to run with it. Honestly, I still want to talk about a lot of different stuff. I still want to talk philosophy, still want to talk Catholicism, all that kind of stuff. This is apologetics channel, not a channel dedicated to one thing. But, I just got an interview with David Roll. I'm probably going to have another interview with David Roll if things go according to plan. Going to have an interview with Dr. Doug Petrovich. I've recently reached out to Dr. David Falk, though he hasn't actually said anything definitively. He's just said he's going to check out the channel and see whether or not it's worth his time, which I totally respect, by the way, because obviously he is a PhD Egyptologist, right? So he has every right to make sure that he vets the people he's going to see, right? And of course, we just had the debate with Jim Majors. I just started writing a book on the historicity of Moses. So I think that this Old Testament heavy theme that I kind of got going is something that I'm going to roll with for a little bit. So with that makes the Bruce Gore interview, I think, that much cooler, because it's kind of like, if we do get the Bruce Gore interview and the David Falk interview, right, then what we'd actually have is an interview with three different very brilliant scholars who each would present in, I think, a very coherent fashion, their respective cases, namely new chronology, traditional date, conventional chronology, traditional date, conventional chronology, conventional date, right, which would be Ramses, that third one. That would be David Falk's position. So I think that that's all going to be really cool. If you guys are interested in that kind of stuff, then obviously hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, and get notified of that when it happens, which again is going to be the 22nd, 2:30 p.m. Other thing I wanted to announce is that I want to, I'm going to just let you guys know I have publicly reached out to Matt Slick about a potential debate on annihilationism. He has not agreed to anything, but he is seemingly leaning towards yes. So I don't want to get anybody too excited. I don't want to get anybody under the impression that Matt has actually agreed to debate me, but it does seem to be something that he is leaning towards the yes side of, and obviously that would be a wonderful conversation. In fact, it might even be an in-person conversation, because me and Matt actually live in the same area. So that would be kind of cool, and obviously want to let you guys know about that. I've also reached out to him about a potential interview to talk about the things we agree on, which is significantly more than we disagree on. But nonetheless, I want to let you guys know about that. By the way, shalom to Jamie Russell. Shalom to Jeremy Martin. Good to see you guys here, and thank you very much for joining. The other thing I did want to let you guys know, somewhat odd, I know, but it shouldn't be, considering those of you who are longtime watchers will know I am very much involved in the anti-porn movement. So I have also reached out to several actual people involved in the pornography business who would consider themselves to be intellectuals. And we might potentially have, at some point, it'll probably be on Modern Day Debate, some conversations about the ethics of pornography. And I think that would be a very solid thing to have, especially with people who are involved in the industry itself. And I think it'll go I think it'll go a very long way in discrediting this industry, frankly, and showing what it actually is just a vehicle to objectify women and to degrade the female form. And I think that's, there's a lot more things to be said about it. It's a vehicle for human trafficking. It certainly is something that degrades the moral fabric of the country. But nonetheless, none of those are guaranteed. None of those are set in stone. I don't even know any names in particular, meaning that nobody has responded back to me yet. But in case you guys see something like that and start to think, well, that's a little weird. Not really. It's actually always been something I've always wanted to be very much involved in. So it's really just finally getting that can kicked, you know what I mean? And getting the ball rolling. By the way, I do have somebody in the room right now. Just so you know, real quick, it's actually John Buck, for those of you who know writer John Buck. I'll be adding you in just 1 second. I just want to give a brief. Actually, you can be in the open room for the analogy. It doesn't actually matter. I wanted to give a brief analogy, or not analogy, but dilemma that I find very interesting, and I wanted to know if it would kickstart any conversation. So, I am a very big fan of, or at least I have been a very big fan of, the Watchmen comic, both the graphic novel and the movie, although there is some significant differences between the two. And in fact, actually, some of you guys would kind of already know that, right? Those of you who have been around when I've talked about my dog, his name is Rorschach. Those of you who watch my Watchdog show know that the motif of the logo is very heavily based off of both the button, right, the smiley face button, and also Rorschach himself. And of course, Watchdog, Watchmen, there was obviously the pun to be played there. It's always been something very interesting to me because it is intensely philosophical. In fact, it's so philosophical that if you watch the movie without that in mind, it's not very enjoyable. And ditto with the book, right? You really do need to understand what you're getting into, because it's not watching the Avengers, or anything like that. There's a scene at the end, and I'm going to go ahead and term the scene Rorschach's Dilemma so that we can get nice and educational about it. There's a scene at the end where the main villain, if you will, the antagonist, because villain doesn't actually properly describe him, has actually destroyed 4 major cities across the world. In the movie, it's by virtue of power he siphons from the only powered character, whose name is Dr. Manhattan. And in the comic, it's actually with a like an alien invasion in the form of this giant octopus monster. It's very weird, but it actually makes a little bit more sense than the movie version if you break it down. But that's not what the point of what I'm saying is. So we'll move on. So this guy Ozymandias, right? He destroys these cities. And his reason for destroying these cities is because the nations involved, specifically the United States and the USSR, are just on the edge of nuclear warfare, right? It's like going to happen tomorrow kind of thing. In fact, there's a running motif throughout the comic of the doomsday clock, and the scientists keep pushing it closer and closer and closer to midnight. And at one point, even getting, I think, actually to midnight, meaning that they thought that the destruction was going to happen. And Ozymandias destroys these places to blame it on a third party so that the nations will unite to try and fight the third party. And again, it's a alien thing in the comic, and it's actually Dr. Manhattan, the hero, in the movie. Both end up being the same effect, though, right? And the character Rorschach has a really big problem with this because he is what you might call a deontologist, and a very rigid moral absolutist as well. So what do those terms mean, right? Well, absolutist basically means, number one, you think that moral facts exist. It is a fact that stealing from somebody is wrong, not an opinion, not a theory, not anything like that, right? And number two, that you actually have moral obligations and duties, and that's what the deontologist part would mean, right? So, for example, if you were to see somebody stealing, you have a moral obligation or duty to report that person for stealing. And of course, there might be some other circumstances that go into play, but just to give you guys very basic examples, right? So that's Rorschach's whole idea. He has a big problem with this. Now, bear in mind, the deaths have already happened. Ozymandias' plan is successful in the story, right? Rorschach is figuring out that it happened along with the rest of the team. He is not fighting to stop it like in your usual superhero movie, right? And so now the framework of the end becomes entirely different. It's not whether or not you can defeat it, but whether or not you accept what has just actually happened. And everybody decides yes, with the one exception being Rorschach. This is why I term it Rorschach's Dilemma. He ends up leaving. And by the way, I'll end up doing at some point like a full video on this because this topic itself is a huge philosophical topic. But he ends up leaving with the implication being he's going to go tell the world what happened. He's going to tell the world that this man just massacred millions of people for the sake of a fake peace, right? Peace based on a lie, as the character Night Owl ends up saying. And eventually, the long and short of it, They decide they can't let Rorschach go. Dr. Manhattan kills him because Rorschach decides he would much rather die than live in a world where he has to keep that kind of a secret. And there's a huge emotional speech that it's got tons of symbolism in it at the end that I won't actually go into now. So the dilemma then, Rorschach's dilemma, right, is you're in a situation where you have just avoided nuclear conflict by massacring millions of people and blaming it on an arbitrary third party, right? Is the peace worth the lie? Does the peace justify the lie? And this really, I think, hits to the heart of consequentialist morality in a way that no other dilemma I've personally seen, which is interesting because Alan Moore is a comic book writer, not a philosopher, in the way that no other dilemma I've seen actually does. And if anybody wants to comment on that, they can. This is an open room, so if they want to go on something completely different, I'm totally fine with that also. But I just wanted to bring that up. And like I said, I'll be doing like a full hour-long episode on that at some point because I think that the issue is that interesting. Shalom, John Buck. Good to see you here.
Shalom. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Just come on. Like I'd only been a sort of recent subscriber to your channel since our brief interaction on Twitter. But yeah, so far I just came in for a little bit, and already I can tell I'm gonna like your channel quite a bit because like you're going off against porn, bringing up Watchmen and ethical dilemmas and things like that. I love it. It's cool.
Oh, I appreciate that. Out of curiosity, have you just since you said you were new to the channel, have you had the have you been able to see the interview with David Roll last week or not last week? I guess it was only a couple days ago, but
no, I did watch the interview that you just did with Chris Date, and I'm a fan of Chris Date as well. I really like his whole project that he has going on his channel and on Twitter that he's doing there. So yeah, it was cool. You don't find too many annihilationists, and I think it's a really interesting position worth defending, especially has quite a bit of biblical support too, I think. So
out of curiosity on that, would you consider yourself an annihilationist or just sympathetic?
I'd say I'm just sympathetic. I probably will have to lean towards the traditional view, being Catholic. But I think, like, I have a friend that's Catholic, and he's done a lot more research than I have onto the topic, and he thinks that the annihilationist position is compatible with being the Catholic dogmas and doctrines that are put forward as teachings. So he takes a sort of like, what is it? I think he takes the position that like the substance of the soul doesn't ever cease to exist, but its conscious aspect does fade away. Sometimes referred to as soul sleep, I guess. In what is it? It might be like Seventh-day Adventists that hold that position, something sort of like that. But he's done a couple debates on it. His name is Dry Apologist on YouTube. But yeah, and I don't know. He's still sort of like feeling it out as a position and how compatible it is with Catholic doctrine. But yeah, he's a fan of annihilationism, and I just find it interesting for I don't know. It's bringing a whole new sort of perspective on hell that I think has been utterly not looked into in the history very well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that too, and I think it is interesting that it appears to me, at least, that the majority of the early church fathers, they don't seem to explicitly be annihilationists, but they do seem to be conditionalist. And it does seem to me like one follows from the other. Like Irenaeus and Justin Martyr both talk quite explicitly about the ceasing, right, of existence for the, and I don't know if they mean about the substance of the soul itself, but of the consciousness of the person. And in fact, Justin Martyr has always been one of the more interesting ones to me because Justin Martyr will commonly be quoted, and honestly, this tends to be a common thing with Justin Martyr, regardless of the issue. He can be quoted on both sides because his language is very speculative. He's a philosopher, right? And so he kind of hangs out on both sides a lot. But he has this quote about conditionalism that, in my opinion, is it kind of right. Like, sorry, I'm eating my words a little bit. If you don't understand that Martyr believed this quote, it can cause you maybe to get in a lot of different places, right? But if you do understand that this is something he actually taught, then it seems almost impossible to deny that he would be somebody who would teach something like like I said,
conditionalist view.
Yeah. And the quote, I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but it's something along the lines of, when they are separated from God into an abyss where nothing exists, and you know, so on and so forth, describing what exactly that is. Maybe if I look it up, I could probably find it. Let's see. Yeah, so it says, for to live is not the soul's attribute as it is God's, but as a man does not live always, and the soul is not forever conjoined with the body, since whenever this harmony must be broken up, the soul leaves the body, and the man exists no longer. And then he says, even so, whenever the soul must cease to exist, the spirit of life is removed from it, and there is no more soul.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, it is still something that I have a lot more like research to go into. But there's I've been listening to this Catholic philosopher Chris Tomaszewski, yeah, I think, and he sort of like has had a couple of interviews talking about I don't know, he takes this position that like you are not the same person that would be there in purgatory, since he's Catholic, since the only thing in purgatory would be the soul sort of disunited from the body. So he thinks that the soul can exist not in conjunction with the body, but that soul that exists is not the same as who we are, because like he takes a hylomorphous view that like we are consciousness and matter, or form and matter, and when that composite object of the form and the matter is sort of taken apart, then the thing that no longer exists in that same way. So like it's only upon either given a new body or giving some sort of spiritual body, I guess, in heaven, something sort of like that. I'm not exactly sure how he would probably articulate it, but I do find it interesting thinking about like, yeah, if we are assuming hylomorphism, that like we are form and matter, and we're like this composite object, and then you take out only one of those things, then if we are identical with the form and matter, then we're not going to be identical to just the form or the soul that's sort of taken out. Yeah, and so it does sort of bring up this, I guess, dilemma, or at least a sort of open question for people, is like, what does it mean to say that your soul exists in the afterlife apart from a body? Is it that like you're given a sort of new body in hell? I think that might have been like Thomas Aquinas's position, that like even in hell there is a sort of bodily existence, but it's a bodily existence with like a not quite material body, or something sort of like that. I'm not exactly sure, just because I haven't looked into it enough. But yeah, I find the whole sort of like conversation quite interesting, and I like hearing the different positions out there.
And I know a lot of the one of the interesting things that I find with it too is whether or not, you know, people talk about whether or not Aristotelianism has any sort of play in it, because Aristotle believes in the eternal existence of the soul, and some people have even said that might come into conflict with creation ex nihilo, which honestly there are certain of the church fathers who would seemingly not agree in that they think it comes into conflict, but who actually kind of proves the point of one who thinks it might. Clement of Alexandria immediately comes to mind. Clement of Alexandria, when you hear him talk about the pre-existence of the soul, a lot of people, even not just like myself, but even like Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox theologians alike, they kind of read it and people they almost get worried. They're like, wait a minute, is this guy like a heretic or something? Like, I don't know what I'm hearing here. And I'm not going that far, by the way. But my point is just to say he was very, very committed to the idea that the soul pre-exists the person, which of course is somewhat taken for granted in a lot of circles today, but I don't think people flesh it out enough. And as a result, Clement of Alexandria would deny things, for example, creatio ex nihilo and nihilo, and would also state things like that he thought the soul was like almost like a divine being in a way. You know what I mean? A lot, kind of like Mormons, honestly, where it's almost like you have this like pre-existent divine self. I don't know if he would necessarily go as far as Mormons. I don't think Clement would go as far as Joseph Smith did to say that we're like mini gods. But it's similar. And people have often had a lot of trepidation when it comes to his work as a result.
Right. Same for Origen. I know, like, not necessarily Origen himself, but at least the positions that he put forward of like the pre-existence of the soul, and it may be like his partial Pelagianism. I guess those were explicitly condemned by some council. I'm not exactly sure which one, but at least those positions. So I knew Origen. I wasn't sure that I didn't know that there was a few others that also held to that sort of pre-existence of the soul. It is a very Gnostic and Platonic sort of view. There might be like, I don't know, maybe Plotinus with his sort of like very Platonic, philosophy. He might flirt with those sorts of ideas. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'd like to look into the origin of that more, of pre-existence. It's got to be mainly or mostly philosophical, right?
For the most part, yeah, it's something that the Bible doesn't actually clearly state one way or the other, to be fair. Although I do think it does in a roundabout way by declaring that God is the creator of all things. I think that, because in my opinion, the Bible does explicitly teach creatio ex nihilo, and I would argue that pre-existence of the soul violates that. And I think I would use Clement of Alexandria as a example, right, where he goes in reverse because he believes in pre-existence of the soul. He thinks that God can't be creating out of nothing. But the fact that I think you can take that in reverse, to me, leads me to believe that going forward works the same way. And so if you take that creatio ex nihilo, I can't say that word, nihilo, is a thing, right, then it seems to me like that would include creation of the individual souls.
That makes sense to me. I would think that I lean towards, I should say, heavily towards creation ex nihilo, but I don't think it just depends on, I guess, what you mean as far as like if you're talking about Genesis and like depends on like what you're trying to. Seems like sometimes people use it for different views for how they kind of like what would you say, like they seem to be wanting to get to a conclusion or something, so they'll doubt certain things. So I don't know if on the pre-existence though, I suppose you could point to the language about the I think Heiser says it seems to be the angels like assisting God. I know a lot of people have a problem with that. As far as let us make man in our image, is that the scholars tend to say that's not really probably the Trinity, I guess, but I don't know. Maybe you can help me with that. Yeah,
the whole divine council theory. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Just before you answer that, how do you pronounce your name? Is it Synagogue?
Yeah, it's a portmanteau. That's actually perfect. It's a portmanteau of cynic and synagogue.
Okay, gotcha. Cool. Yeah. I'd lean creatio ex nihilo, but only probably for philosophical reasons. I don't think that like Genesis 1:1 exactly like explicitly demands that you have to believe in creatio ex nihilo. I think that probably for the time period, it wasn't exactly understood in that way. But I mean, it could be interpreted that way. I just think that would just be a sort of like modern interpretation that's being read into the text rather than being read from it. But yeah,
that is exactly what I meant to say. Like that it encapsulates how I feel, what I think.
Yeah. What I don't know how familiar you are with Michael Heiser synagogue.
So I can't say like incredibly. Like I'm very familiar with the things he believes, but like not like read his work kind of familiar,
right? Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which I there was a time I wouldn't have differentiated, but now like having read certain people and then hearing other people who like they know of people and they like hear them online, but they haven't read the work. It's like, oh, I understand why people used to get mad at me for this now. You know what I mean? But yeah, no, I haven't read any Michael Heiser books or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm sort of the same. Like I've listened to quite a few lectures of his, but I haven't actually read The Unseen Realm. So I mean, I want to. I just know it's going to be like quite a beast to get through. But yeah, I think he brings in some really interesting like cases that like not a lot of Christians really think about. Is like the whole divine counsel thing. And I think there's some like pretty explicit mentions of it within Scripture, and it's something to wrestle with. Now, I suppose you could probably, I don't know, maybe take it as, I don't know, analogical, like take an analogical reading from it, that like maybe for the polytheistic culture, then their best way of understanding how God could be all wise was through understanding God as having like some sort of council of other divine beings that he sort of like talks to and things like that. You could probably take that view, and like maybe that, like if you want to take a like purely monotheistic position that like no other actual divine beings exist, then that could probably be the way that you read those particular passages. As just sort of like maybe from the authors of those particular books, they thought this about God, but I don't know if that's necessarily binding for like all Christians everywhere to also hold those exact positions as well. But and then like I don't think it really like threatens monotheism, even to say that there's these other sort of divine beings that are out there that are maybe one rung higher than angels, but definitely one serious rung lower than God above all, and just say that God gives them certain authorities over particular domains. It does feel sort of weird, like it is very much polytheistic, but it's I don't know, I think it's distinct from typical polytheism, where like I don't know if there's a denial of a supreme God over all things, because it seems like typical polytheism is very disharmonious, where you have one God ruling over the sea, one God ruling over the farmland, one God ruling over war, and different things like that. And these are all sort of like not in coordination with each other at all. And I think it's much more harmonious actually having that like proper hierarchy of God overall that's working through these other divine beings or angels or human beings or kings. I think that's just the easier way to sort of understand reality, I guess, if you want to include divine beings into it, your ontology.
Well, and I've always kind of thought, I think that the way that we think about it could be a little bit more simplified, and that might actually like iron out some of the problems. So, like for example, and by the way, I'm not hammering at you or anything like that, because it's the same term that everybody else uses as well, including Heiser himself. But right, divine beings, right? You notice there's an implication in that word divine. What if it was just simply like metaphysical, spiritual, something like that beings, like an angel, for example, right? Where it's like they are greater than us power-wise, but they're not necessarily actually greater than us necessarily, right? It's a lot like the noble. And in fact, I would even point out how you said, it doesn't necessarily violate monotheism. I think if you start thinking of it kind of in that way, where it's just beings who are spiritual, almost like nobility, you have a perfect parallel in monarchy, right? Nobility doesn't violate monarchy, and it doesn't even violate absolute monarchy. You can have feudalistic societies with feudalistic nobilities, but you can also have an absolute monarch who just happens to have an aristocracy around him. In fact, they usually do. I think most of the time, a monarchy is not quite as autocratic as people might initially think. Monarchs do tend to have like advisors and ministers and stuff like that, right? They're not quite like military dictators, which is why we distinguish the two. But when you think of it like that, it's almost like I think it takes away a lot of the loaded language, know.
So with this, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say quickly, it could potentially even offer some explanations for some odd things as well, like how somebody might be able to experience visions of Moroni, for example, assuming that Joseph Smith was not lying, which I actually do believe he was, to be fair. But assuming he wasn't, right?
I see. Yeah,
like it would be. You could explain that by virtue of, well, it's just simply like a not a divine being, almost like a metaphysical being. You know what I mean, like an angel.
Okay, so I guess you could read Like the one that is probably most familiar to people is just sort of the opening of Job. And now I recognize that Job is sort of like a poetic literature, but I think it still brings up the point that this is sort of how the author of Job considered like the sort of like metaphysical worldview of like how God acts. And like, so there's this, what's referred to as the divine council. So are you, I don't know, it seems like there's sort of two ways in which to interpret what you were saying. Either that like the divine council are just angels. So they're not really like divine beings. They're just like created angels in the same way that like we already believe that Michael and Gabriel and Satan or Lucifer were angels. Or are you saying more like these were like noble men from the past that God has sort of like exalted up to sit in his throne room to sort of like dialogue with? Like I don't know, maybe you want to say Enoch, or maybe Elijah or Abraham, or I don't know, certain people sort of like that. I'm not sure which one you're sort of going for.
So it would be more the first one.
Okay.
The comparison to nobility would simply be to say it would almost be like a divine nobility, right? So think like Michael the Archangel, right? To give a crude analogy, Michael the Archangel is actually Michael himself would not fit this role. If you wanted to actually use this analogy, Jesus would fit this role. But like prime minister or vizier is a word we usually use associated with monarchies. Prime minister nowadays is more associated with parliamentary governments. But you know what I mean? Where it's like that, and it does appear to me that there is that kind of a thing going on scripturally. But I don't think it would be accurate to use the word like divine beings per se. In fact, I do think and this is very speculative, it's not something that I like am by any means adopting, but if there were beings out there that were divine, if there were any truth to like the pagan religions or anything like that, right? Mm-hmm. I would argue it would be possible for these divine beings, the ones who claim to be divine beings, to actually be the deceivers who would say, "Oh, hey, I'm Zeus," or something like that. You know what I mean? And again, I'm not even necessarily saying that, because I do believe that the Zeus stories are fictional, made up kind of stuff. But like the point just being that if there were like beings in this realm who would be quote unquote divine, I actually think it would be a false divinity that would be attributed probably to the fallen ones. And similarly to the nobility analogy, you wouldn't expect even your vizier, the most powerful of nobles who's under you, to start doing things outside of your purview, right? Or to start claiming himself to be royalty. He wouldn't even claim himself to be part of the royal family, because he's not. And precisely because he's loyal to you, would he not do such a thing? You know what I mean? If he did, he's probably not loyal to you. You know what I mean?
That's the part with Heiser where I start to take a little bit of issue, although I do like most of the ideas he's put forth, although I haven't read everything he writes, but I've read one of his books and I've read some of his articles on his site. But that's the part, like you're saying, the idea that God appointed these, let's call them Elohim or whatever, small e, over the nations. I struggle with that part of his work, because like you're saying, it just seems weird that God, I guess he's saying that God did it as almost like a punishment because of their disobedience at Babel. I think that's right, but that's the one part that's hard for me. But it seems like Elohim is the way the Bible, that's the word, right? Like in Psalm 82 or the Deuteronomy passage or whatever he brings up. So, but I like your idea about kind of the ranking or whatever whatever you were calling it.
Like aristocracy is. I use aristocracy, also nobility.
Yeah, I don't know if it quite matches like to what the text says though, because it seems like there is sort of a distinction between like what's referred to as the sons of El or the sons of God versus just like the messengers or the angels. Now I get that like angel is like the word there is messenger, which is purely a functional sort of like role that you might have. Like you could say Jesus was a messenger, or anybody that's like delivering a message from God is technically a messenger or an angel in a sort of sense.
Well, and actually, just to quickly add to that, Malachi, right? His name, you could translate it as angel, although we usually translate it as messenger.
Right. Yeah. But I don't know. It seems like in the passages where it's talking about, it seems like, it's talking about, so what is it? Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Oh, wait, that's maybe not the... Oh, yeah, that's right. Because that's the whole controversy is whether it's it says it's children of Israel or the children of Elohim there.
Is it actually B'nai Elohim there, or is it something else? Because I know he contends that it should be sons of God, right?
Right. Yeah, that's what Michael's position is, and it seems like there's a few translation that does translate it to that. So Bible Hub.
Well, I would kind of, and I understand that this might be it's not like I made it up by any stretch, but it's not something that is typically, I think, accepted in evangelical circles. Although, interestingly enough, it did used to be the original fundamentalist position. I actually think the sons of God in Genesis is just reference to Seth's line. My reason for believing that, I think there's a couple of things. So, number one, this is one of the weaker points, to be fair, but number one, Luke does refer to Adam as the son of God. And that's obviously not in the same way that Jesus is the son of God, but in the self-same way that you could say that I, Josiah, am the son of David, even though David was 400 years ago, you would then be able to say of Adam's lineage, I am the son of God, right? And that would really only apply to the lineage that is coming through one particular line, namely Seth's line. Why? Well, because that's just the way that these things tended to work out, right? So just as an example, Abraham, the sons of Abraham, it's not that Ishmaelites aren't literally sons of Abraham. They are, and they even claim such. But the promise, because the birthright, is to Isaac. Likewise, Esau is a son of Isaac, but Jacob is the one who the promise is to. Obviously, Jacob's sons are a little bit different because there's the 12 of them, and they all kind of have inheritance equally in a way. Although they're not necessarily, right? The Levites are the priests. The Judahites actually get the kingship. Not every son of David is obviously going to be the next crown prince, so on and so forth, right? So the lineage is only actually ever counted, usually, with the exception of the 12 tribes, through one line. And then, like I said, even with the 12 tribes, there is still specific lines that are counted, right? So that does, to me, seem to give precedent for calling the Sethite line sons of God, right? On top of that, believers are usually referred to as sons of God in the New Testament. It doesn't usually appear that way in the Old Testament, but it does sometimes. Israel is called the firstborn, right? There's other parental kind of literature like that as well in the scripture and terminology, right? But then the other thing that I think is kind of vitally important about it, honestly, is the fact that it's kind of an Occam's razor thing, right? You have one line that exists apart from everybody because Cain left, right? He goes to the land of Nod, and whether there was, some people say pre-Adamite, some people say that's his probably like a sister or something like that. Whatever it is, he marries somebody and he leaves and he goes elsewhere, right? Well, if you have one line that exists and another line that exists and they're both there and they're already separate, well, then it seems to me like Occam's razor would suggest that they're the two who came together and made it. You know what I mean? Now, the immediate question is, of course, how does that produce giants? I don't have an answer for that. I got to be honest with you. I really don't. But it would seem odd to me that it would be angels. And this is sort of the last part I'll say, which is not in favor of the Sethite line thing, but kind of against the angel thing. One of the harsher verses in the Bible is the even though it's not necessarily meant to be, is talking about marriage in heaven and how it's not going to be a thing. A lot of people struggle with that, right? But notice apart from that portion, there is the comparison and the reason why, right? And it's because we're going to be like the angels. So the angels don't actually have intercourse, seems to be the thing. And if the angels are seemingly doing that in the case of Genesis, that seems like a contradiction to me.
Yeah, but you could just say that the angels were just fallen angels. Like, so yeah, all the angels that are in heaven, they won't have any sort of intercourse. But for the angels that have fallen from heaven and are capable of taking a sort of bodily form, as shown with like Abraham's interactions with Elohim or Jacob wrestling with the angel or with God. I mean, you like maybe in heaven, where everyone's like so close to God and in a sort of perfected state. None of those angels, like we wouldn't expect Michael or Gabriel to have sex with daughters of men. But for the angels that have fallen, then I don't think it's like metaphysically impossible for them to have intercourse with humans.
Yeah, that opens up a whole can of worms, kind of, because the context of Jesus' words, right, was like when they question him about whose wife the woman would be if, as her husbands die and the brothers take over the marriage, right? I believe. And so the question is like, well, if your view is that in the restoration or whatever at the end of Revelation, if that's how you take heaven and it's not just like an eternal heaven, then that to me leaves the door open that he's not necessarily saying there won't be any more procreation at all ever in the future, but just in heaven, there wouldn't be like the angels, because I think he specifically says angels in heaven. And then so I know like Chuck Missler, I've heard him try to explain that by saying it's because they left their first estate or whatever, or, they left their, forget the word, what it is, but it's kind of like their tent or whatever is a way to think of it or something. If that means their form or if it just means like where they come from, I'm not sure. I think you could take it either way, but the sons of God thing I just wanted to say before I forget, I like the way I think I heard him describe it too. It's like if you take the primary meaning of son of God or whatever to mean like, or at least in the literal sense or how it's just defined, it would be like the direct creation of God. So like every angel would be in that sense a son of God because he's like created directly from God. Like he's not a lineage or like like Adam's a son of God also because God made him from the not being born dust. And so
right, yeah.
And I take that to make the most sense to me, but then it's adopted from there for other uses, like for lineages perhaps, and then that kind of blends into like the New Testament usage where you must be born again by the Spirit, and in that sense you become a literal son of God or child of God because you're born again, directly born of God kind of thing.
Well, and I could kind of like see where you're coming from a little bit. I guess my counter would just be that I think the Bible is more likely to use sons in a sense of genealogies.
That's a thing you made me realize just when I was listening to you. So I was like, man, it seems so arbitrary, not arbitrary, but very multifaceted in that sense. So I think you might have convinced me.
Well, and of course, definitely, obviously we all want to make sure we're thinking about it a lot and, praying and being in the Spirit and all that. Right. But, it is an interesting thing though, right? Like, you can go talk to a Jewish guy right now. It doesn't even have to be a Jewish believer, just a guy who is ethnically Jewish. Right. And he's a son of Jacob, at least according to him and his culture. Right. Mm-hmm. And in a literal way, he is the blood descendant of, the Jacobin clan, right? But of course, Jacob died, 3,000-4,000 years ago? He's not a literal son of Jacob, right? but the Bible would call him a son of Jacob, and they do also a son of David. In fact, Jesus is called a son of David. The sons of Levi, the sons of Aaron, right? The sons of Levi being the priest, the sons of Aaron being the high priests, and not just the high priest, but also like a specific clan of the priesthood itself, because obviously not every single one of the sons of Aaron is going to be the singular high priest. That wouldn't make any sense. But you know what I mean? And so it's I wouldn't say necessarily 100% of the time. Don't get me wrong. Like there is certainly like the sons of Jesse is talking about Jesse's actual sons. But
right. That's like the literal. That's what would be like the literal definition, and then it might make sense to say like what I was kind of trying to say was like there's the literal technical, or what technical maybe is a better way to look at it, sense of it. Obviously, like if we just think about it, like you have sons when you have children, right? And then, but then that continues on. So like you're just trying to point back to the source kind of thing, and as you see the like the usage expand, like in that sense, you know, to help like lead to Christ and the things that are necessary, where he comes from and stuff, and then you see the usage of that is real, like in the New Testament you see Christ, the fulfillment come to pass, you know, the Messiah comes, and then he calls his church or the body or whatever in your ear, like in Christ. And you know, I mean, there's all sorts of like interesting imagery about temple and the temple and stuff like that, but you know, it almost makes sense from like a historical point of view to see it like expand in its usage into the New Testament, which is like, so you wouldn't want to read that into necessarily every Old Testament use or whatever of sons of God and insist that these are always godly people, let's say. Maybe it just means it in a technical sense, like, so like in that sense in Job, you know, what is a son of God in Job? I mean, how do you take that, for instance, since it seems to be talking about pre-creation of at least the physical universe?
Well, so I guess there'd be a couple things with that. The first thing is I wouldn't necessarily disagree that Son of God could never, or I wouldn't necessarily, hang on, how am I wording this? Son of God can refer to angels, is what I'm trying to say. I wouldn't say that it never refers to angels, right? I would just say I think in this particular instance, I think there is some good precedent to understand it as the sons of Seth. And to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure about this, so don't quote me on this. I don't know if this is something I would go out and like teach per se, but I don't think that the sons, the angels rather, are ever referred to as sons of God outside of Job. And actually, I'm not even 100% sure that, you know, I'd have to even look at that to see.
I was just looking up an article, I guess in Psalms 29:1 and Psalm 89:6, that seems to refer to angels as B'nai Ha Elohim, sons of God.
By the way, I'm open to the Seth view. In fact, I'm very unsure still in my own mind.
Yeah. So okay. So what's the reason to think that like when it's talking about sons of God, it's referring to the men that God created, or like the people of the lineage of Adam, just because Adam was technically created out of dust, and then. I get what you're saying with like Luke. Yeah, there's definitely that connection to Jesus' genealogy that like God, like God created Adam, who gave progenited all these other long line of men, and then eventually God came about again, was actually incarnate. But I don't know if like that's strong enough, especially since like what I'd want to look at is like where in the particular books or the book of Genesis that we do see that sort of connection there of like, yeah, when we're talking about a son of God, we're referring to the lineage of Seth. But I did like your other point though, that like there's that sort of I don't know, distinction is drawn that there's these is it Midianite, or is the other people that are like there at that time. It seems like they're sort of drawing a distinction between the lineage of Seth and these other people that are around at that time. But I don't think that we don't see referring to those people of Seth as like sons of God. I don't think we even do we see like Adam referred to as the son of God anywhere in Genesis? I mean, I get that.
That's a good point. Good point.
He is like created by God directly, but I don't know if that particular vernacular is given to Adam or any of his lineage, at least explicitly. It could be like this could be that instance, but I'd want to look at it. Yeah, so sons of God.
I don't think that he's ever explicitly referred to by the phrase Benael. And so what I would kind of say in sort of like a response, because I do understand that for sure, right? How that could be a I guess issue. So there's a couple things that I would say. So the first thing is we kind of have to agree that we're all being somewhat speculative, unfortunately. And the only reason I say that is because there is also no instance in Genesis where Benael refers to an angel. So we would have it in, so we saw Job, and then you just found Psalms. I'm not going to make any definitive claims just because I don't know for sure. It's not used anywhere else there.
I'd have to look at those further too.
Right. But we do have it in numerous instances referring to human beings, right? We have Adam. We do have Jesus, who of course he's a unique human being, but we do believe he's 100% man, right? Mm-hmm. We have the children of Israel being called sons of God, and we have, of course, us being called sons and daughters of God in the New Testament, which of course would be in Greek. And so I think there is a little bit of a precedent outside of, but I would agree there would be precedent outside of the Bible in both instances for sure, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say that's 100% of the argument.
So okay, sorry, you finish your point, and then I'll bring up a sort of alternate interpretation for those as well.
Yeah. So what I would kind of hammer home on is what it seems to me is a running theme in Genesis is the distinguishing of the generations, right? So you have Ishmael and Isaac, and again, Ishmael is the son of Abraham, and he even gets promise from Abraham in a very real way, right? In fact, we can see that from the Arabs to this day. They're one of the most populous and powerful ethnic groups in the world, right up there with English and Mandarin, right? But the promise is through Isaac, and the lineage is counted through Isaac, and the generations are counted through Isaac, right? And so we have a split here. The same thing we see happens to Jacob, right? Where we have Jacob and Esau, both literal sons of Isaac. And again, Esau even does get a little bit of a blessing, although significantly not quite the same thing as what Ishmael ends up getting, right? There's a lot of nuance there to be said, but nonetheless, the lineage though is something that we are actually getting through Jacob. And even elsewhere, we do end up seeing that despite the fact that all 12 of these tribes have inheritance, technically 13 if you want to count the fact that Joseph split into two, it really actually is only through one, which is Judah, right? Who does end up being the one who gets the birthright in the book of Genesis. And so if we take that back, right, what we seem to be having, and by the way, we see it again with Seth, right? Seth is distinguished from Japheth and Ham as the lineage. We take that back all the way down to the first split, and it's Cain and Seth. Cain is one lineage, Seth is another. And Seth's lineage starts with Adam, but Cain's doesn't, right? Cain's is considered to start on his own. Right. Just same thing with Esau, same thing with Ishmael. Right. It's almost like we're trying to separate these two, even though they're brothers. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I think that's an important, I honestly think that that's the important thing when it comes to this, just because it's such a trend, it seems, in Genesis of the brothers being split apart to form the one that carries on the father's lineage and the one who kind of goes off and does his own thing.
Right.
The ones who call on the name of the Lord, sort of thing. The good ones. That's what they mean, I think, when they say the sons of Seth. That's all they're saying. It's like the Bible makes the distinction. That's all I want to say.
Yeah. And I think that should probably be like the sort of basic default view, maybe, is like understanding when talking about sons of God, we're referring to like the people that were walking in righteousness to a certain degree, and like can very well be the case that they fell away and like did things that like I think there's a strong concern, especially within Genesis and in a lot of the Old Testament, is having sort of this clean bloodline. Like that's a concern that I think a lot of ancient people had, that it from our modern sort of viewpoint doesn't make a lot of sense to us. But the fact that there is a sort of, oh God, racial purity that is there from having a clean generations. I mean, you see it like continually in Genesis, like the concerns about how having sending out Jacob to Laban just because they actually share lineage with one another, rather than taking a wife from that foreign land that they're within. So yeah, if we think about like the sons of God as just referring to the people who walked in righteousness with God, they're in a sense the sons of God. I mean, they're still men, and then when talking about, say, the daughters of men, those would just be the people that aren't in that same sort of covenant, I guess, with God. And so there's that concern, especially for a very purity culture or a priestly culture, where you're concerned about being very racially pure, having that connection there between, I'm only marrying those within your tribe or within your family, because you know that there's no, I don't know. I think it's partially tied to like talking about like hooking up an ass with an oxen for plowing the field. It's like having these two different things put together is something that the ancient people saw as like utterly taboo.
Yeah, and they didn't even make. I mean, if you think about, like, if you take the Genesis story literally or whatever, which I tend to, but like in that context, what does racial even mean if you're all related, like how we think of racial? You know what I mean? Like being, what distinction could they make other than, you're calling on the Lord or not?
Well, and I think the distinction is a little bit more, and I know the nuance is somewhat weird, because I think we kind of just use them interchangeably in the modern day, but I think it's more of an ethnic distinction than
that was a poor wording on my part. It's definitely more to do with the ethnic component rather than any sort of like racial component.
Well, and to be fair, you're totally fine. I mean, like if somebody were to walk up to, all three of us are white people. Let's just say, just for argument's sake, right, that we formed the I Hate Ireland Club, right? The majority of people would say that's racist, even though that it's actually not, right? We're all white people, so therefore, by definition, that can't be racist because they're also white people, right? It's an ethnic thing.
Right.
But it is still a thing that's what people's default is. You know what I mean? Is to think of that as a racial thing. And it is, it's interesting that as a result, you do find, I think you muddy the waters a little bit, because obviously I don't want to go form the I Hate Ireland Club, right? But obviously I Hate Ireland Club is probably a lot different than the Ku Klux Klan, right? Like and to give an example of a real world example, the Irish Republican Army, since we're talking about Ireland, I mean, they're very opposed to the British, but there's reasons for it. And whether you agree with them or not is not the point. The point is that they want to fight for what they consider to be their right to self-rule, right? And there's a long history of, we've been fighting these British people, or English people, really more specifically, for hundreds and hundreds of years at this point. You know what I mean? And again, not to endorse anything or anything like that, but it's significantly different than the Ku Klux Klan. I don't like the color of this person's skin, right? And to bring that back to the scriptural point, that you have a similar thing going on, right? Where it's like, it's not just that these people are from the other places. It's that there's a long history here of false gods, of abhorrent pagan practices, of things that we as a culture, we being the Israelites, have just decided we utterly, despise, really, by virtue of the fact that we worship this God who utterly despises it. And of course, at various times, they decided that they did not actually want to follow that, and God had to send a prophet to remind them. But
it's so muddy.
Say again?
Oh, it is so muddied. That's true. Like the whole concept here, and I think you're right on.
Well, and I appreciate that, because it is something I think that is. It like I said, it's not. It could help us, by the way, in politics a lot too, because I think that a lot of different prejudices, if you actually properly like deduced what was the matter with people and why they had these prejudices, they're usually on some level of ethnic line as well, and there's usually a reason for there's almost always a reason for ethnic conflict, because an ethnicity is simply a group of related peoples. You know what I'm saying? We would, in a way, be the same ethnicity, being that we're all American. Wait, you're American, right, John?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we're exactly right. So now obviously America is a huge melting pot that is ginormous in size. So it is possible that we actually don't share any sort of a relation whatsoever. But probably not. Honestly, at this point, this nation's over 200 years old. It's probably safe to assume that everybody, if you go far enough back, is sharing some relation with people. And it's only going to get more and more the case as time goes on, right? If the United States exists another 200 years, the American ethnicity will become more and more related, right? In certain nations, it happens faster than others. Like, for example, you can easily distinguish like the Mexican ethnicity from the Cuban ethnicity, right? Why that happened faster than America, I'm not really sure, to be honest with you, but it did. And that obviously, when you're talking about an ethnicity, right, and when you're talking about something like a nation, well, now you're completely changing the dynamic, because it's not a hatred for some sort of a prejudice reason. It's more like, okay, nations have histories, cultures, conflicts. So why do these nations dislike each other? You know what I mean? And from the biblical perspective, I think the answer becomes rather obvious. I think that it's because the surrounding nations, people are real ignorant about the ancient world. I don't say that in an insulting way by any stretch. I'm just saying like some of the practices, if there are children in the room, cover your ears for just a second, because I'm going to tell you guys some stories about some things that some ancient people did religiously. Like, this is to worship gods, right? So one example is in Sparta. In Sparta, there's record that before young men specifically would go to war for the first time, they would sacrifice a puppy to the god Ares by burning it alive, right? Here's another example for you. This one's actually explicitly mentioned in the scriptures. There was a Canaanite practice where you would milk whatever your creature was, goat, sheep, cow, whatever, and then you would boil alive that specific creature's calf in that milk to create a religious meal. Here's another practice for you. This actually comes from Herodotus about Babylon. There was a practice in Babylon where every girl who lived in Babylon, at least according to Herodotus, if he can be trusted, was to at least once in their lifetime go down to the city center and prostitute themselves. And the amount of money did not matter. You could literally throw a penny at them and they would have to. And you could be this disgusting, you just wretched old man. It didn't matter because it was a religious thing now. It would be a sin to say no, right? I could go on and, by the way, have not even scratched the surface of the worst, right? Pagan religion is rough, nasty stuff, right? And so when you put that in perspective, like the ethnic distinctions are a little bit more understandable, I think. You know what I mean? And that's why. So first off, when you point out that ethnic is different than racial, I think you can get people to start getting on board. But and then when you point out why there's these ethnic distinctions in the past, you know what I mean? It's like, I mean, pagan religion, it's savage. It's savage. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a lot less of a melting pot going on back in the farther you go back too. So it's the generalizations are generally more applicable, I think. And so it makes sense in that the Bible would make less of a distinction than we tend to want to make now, especially in America, I'd say.
Yeah, and it's partially the fault of the intellectuals too. I mean, a lot of intellectuals will, like, you read it, you watch something like a documentary on the Canaanites, right? And this is a direct quote from, I think it was Israel Finkelstein, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, it was on a documentary, so it might not have been Finkelstein, but nonetheless, it was on this documentary, and they're talking about the Canaanites. and they say, well, the Bible presents this view of the Canaanites as these barbarous, child-sacrificing brutes. But in reality, that's not true at all. They were actually quite sophisticated. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, like, okay, I don't understand where the contradiction is here. You just threw out a red herring. Oh, they made beautiful pottery, so therefore they couldn't have sacrificed children. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But of course, if you're a layperson and you hear that, what it sounds like this person is saying is the Bible is wrong, and they actually, no, we've dug up this stuff. We know exactly what pagan religion was. And it wasn't just the Canaanites. It was Babylon. It was Assyria. It was Greece. It was Rome, right? It was a lot of these guys. And the intellectuals don't help, right? The intellectuals, because they just lie and deceive about it, frankly. You know what I mean? They try to make these pagans look as if they were these nature-loving, peaceful, kumbaya singing, everybody needs to get along kind of, you know what I mean? It's just not the case at all.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to even want to say anything because, I don't want to like pretend like I would know better than some expert or whatever. But yeah, sometimes you wonder how much they lose track of like their own preferences and thinking, that get mixed up with what's put out, and just the way people interpret what people say too is a problem there, I think. And it's hard to know what to say about it.
Well, you know what it is? It's a love of man. And let me give you a perfect example that's going to shock you at first, okay? But when you listen to me, not only are you going to agree, but you might even be a little bit angered, right? So, when one looks objectively at the last 100 years, one will find, and looks at that in conjunction with the last, couple of years of history, one will easily find that Hitler and the Nazis are, in a way, historically mistreated. Now, what do I mean by that, right? I mean that they actually were not unique in history. Hitler is a lot like Napoleon Bonaparte, who's a lot like Julius Caesar, who's a lot like Genghis Khan, who's a lot like Alexander the Great. But for some reason, Hitler's name means very, 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 very evil, and Alexander and Julius and all them don't, right? All right, so where are you going with this, Jay? This is sounding kind of weird. All right, that's the part that shocks you. So the question now becomes, are we right about Hitler and wrong about everyone else, or are we wrong about everyone else, or right about everyone else and wrong about Hitler, right? And I think the answer is pretty obvious to everybody. Hitler was obviously a terrible person. Going out and wanting to conquer the world, that's a horrible thing. Slaughtering people because you think you're so awesome and your people are so awesome, right? That's a horrible, horrible, wretched, terrible, awful thing. All the words you can think of, right? And yet, Julius Caesar, Ramses the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, Alexander the Great, these guys are heroes. These guys are Alexander the Great, because so this is literally the story of Alexander the Great. I am not exaggerating at all. Guy is born, gets so high on himself that he declares himself son of Zeus and says, you know what? I'm so cool and my culture is so cool that I am going to slaughter all of the known world until they submit to me and declare me a god so that I can convert them all to Greek culture. That is literally the story of Alexander the Great. You know who else that's the story of? If you replace the word Greek with German, and if you replace the word Zeus with Aryan, Adolf Hitler. Verbatim. You know what I'm saying? But Alexander is the Great, and Adolf Hitler is synonymous with evil. You see what I'm saying? Like, but it's because
Hitler probably loved his mother more too. It's kind of
right, for real. For real. And the point being that Alexander the Great is adored because of an adoration of man. Even though we know, because we have an Alexander the Great who lived in the last 100 years, that person is wretched. That person's evil, right? But we look at it through this rosy historical, no, he was so great and he provided us Greek culture because they adore the accomplishments of man. It's the same thing with the Canaanites, right? That's why you notice they change. They couldn't have been brutish because they were sophisticated. Well, what if they were just sophisticated brutes? You know what I mean? And I think that's a really common thing throughout history. And I wouldn't even just use Alexander the Great. Julius Caesar is another perfect example. Julius Caesar is a wretched man. You know what I mean? That dude is evil. That dude, the Gauls do not exist because of that man's successful genocide, right? Hernan Cortez is an example. I mean, as much as people don't I'm not, don't get me wrong, I am not the flaming liberal, but Christopher Columbus is a perfect example. Let's be real here, right? And a lot of other folks as well. And it's just this because the idea just being we adore the accomplishments of man, and when they're far away, it's a lot easier to adore the accomplishments of man. There was a time when Napoleon was seen the same way Hitler was, not anymore because he's far away. But anyways, I'm ranting.
Well, to quote Kathy Newman, so what you're saying is Hitler is a hero. No, I'm joking. I read you loud and clear, man. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. That's why I like Jordan Peterson. He makes that point too. Like he says one of the reasons what he was trying to do in one of his classes that he was teaching was to make his students understand that most of them, if not all of them, would probably have been Nazis if they were born in the right time in the right place, sort of thing. And I mean, that may or may not be the case, but the point is the same kind of deal. It's just like, if Hitler had won, you might have an iPhone 20 by now or whatever, It's like you got to think of it realistically here in context. But I read you, man. I agree. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think the point I think both of you brought up really is quite apt in regards to why is it that certain scholars will want to say that, yeah, sure, Hitler was completely evil, but no, there are all these other nations and things like that, and it is sort of I think it might be part of the sort of humanist thesis that human beings are sort of intrinsically good. They'll have their natural tendencies, and that'll just be what is good. These natural tendencies for certain things is what they should be doing, and any instances of people doing things that are actually evil, that could only have been brought about through some sort of propaganda or some sort of cultural effect of maybe society that took place or things like that. But no, I think that it's pretty obviously the case that, I mean, we live in a fallen world. It's not just humans, but animals have the same sort of instinctive drive to conquer, and it's not necessarily a perfect desire to be fulfilled. I don't know. Yeah, that point though about how if you were born into Germany in the 1940s, you would be in probably very similar circumstances and have certain similar opinions as the people in Hitler's army as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I do think too that it's. I honestly think there needs to be a complete and total revamp of the way people think of history. First off, I do think that there does need to be some humanizing of the German army in a way, because they were people. They're not stormtroopers, right? In fact, even stormtroopers in the rules of the universe are people, just for the record, you know what I mean? So you can't even use that example, but the point just being they're not like a faceless blob, right? They were human beings.
Right.
And understanding them as human beings helps us to avoid that in the future.
Yeah.
But also, I do think the people we glorify in history, that is a very interesting thing in my opinion. Because I've always actually thought, especially when you look at the one that kind of got me was the destruction of Tyre from Alexander. And it's just this dude was brutal. He killed all of the dudes, and then he sold all the women and children into slavery, and then he destroys the city, and then he builds up a new Greek city and names it Alexandria just to make sure that there is no way that these people will ever come back again. You know what I mean? It's that is literally genocide. You know what I mean? But he's Alexander the Great. And again, I'm not saying we should call Hitler Adolf the Great. I'm saying Alexander should be looked at the same way that Hitler is. You know what I mean? But anyways, we have S.J. Thomason actually joining us. By the way. Shalom.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, long time no talk.
Again. Yeah, it's been a while. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I've been painting all week, the inside of our house, and I decided to take a break today. So I've been just hanging around YouTube.
Yeah. It's been nice to have a sort of restful weekend for once. It seems like my last few have all been super busy, so it's nice to just sit at home and enjoy the time to relax. It's good.
Yeah, that's good. Is it a Hawaiian shirt you're wearing?
Yeah.
Nice.
Festive sort of attire that I'll throw on occasions.
Yeah, I like those colors. Those are nice.
My parents went to Hawaii years ago, and it's so funny because my dad came home and he was wearing a shirt like that and then matching shorts. And it was so funny because I looked at his closet and he still has that thing today. That's from when I was like in 5th grade. Hilarious.
That's the perfect thing. They never go out of style. No.
That's true.
No.
So I heard you guys talking about Alexander the Great and comparing him to Hitler.
Yeah, that's an old contention of mine that I'm going to try and popularize if I end up becoming a popular person. Is the notion that I think that Alexander the Great is the moral equivalent of Adolf Hitler. So I take a view that is really I went through it a little bit, but I'll just go kind of quick. It's a little controversial, but it's not. I think when people hear me out, it becomes less controversial. I believe that the Nazis are very historically mistreated, meaning that we see them as unique, and I don't believe that they are. I think when you compare them to the empires of the past, Hitler is Napoleon, is Alexander, is Julius. I think that it's the same narcissistic, very ethnocentric personality type. And when I say mistreated, I don't mean that we shouldn't look down on the Nazis. What I do mean is that it is very odd that we glorify so many people who act like them. You know what I mean? And including the genocidal part. Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan all committed very, very vicious genocides numerous times. But they're like these lauded historical figures, you know what I mean? And whereas these Nazis are obviously seen as the absolute pinnacle of evil. And I think that's a contradiction. And you can go one of two ways with that, right? You can either say, well, then we need to glorify the Nazis, and that's obviously not good. So what's the only other option? These other people must be evil. And I think that's true. I think that, people like, and I use Alexander the Great as the main example because I think he's the one who people glorify the most out of everyone I just mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. Just killing all the people, taking all the slaves, all that kind of stuff that people did in the ancient times. It's horrific in a modern sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the reasoning even too, right? I think that's a big portion of the point, like, because, it's one thing, I think, when you have like a Nat Turner, right? Nat Turner did some pretty hellacious things. And so for those who don't know, Nat Turner was a slave who revolted in America. And he, some of his things were pretty heinous. I mean, he killed women and children of slave masters, right? Women being the wives, of course. And he was obviously going to target specifically white households, right? We would look at that as racist. We would look at that as very cruel, all this kind of stuff. It's obviously there's some understanding though in the motive, right? Even if you don't agree with what he did, you can understand, well, this man was a slave trying to free himself and his brothers and stuff like that. Whereas you look at somebody now like Alexander, much like somebody like Adolf Hitler, and the reason that they're attacking this people, it's really twofold. The first one is because I being Alexander or Adolf, am very awesome, right? And the second one being that my culture is also very awesome. And it's like, it's just purely, it's just purely like ego trip, really. It's almost like, not to use a crass analogy, but it's almost like these guys are taking syringes and shooting themselves up with narcissism. You know what I mean? They're just like, we're so awesome that people need to speak our language in Africa, even though we live in Greece. You know what I mean? And like, I don't know. I find it to be very morally similar.
That reminds me of something that you just said. In the Cyrus cylinder, I was listening to a video on the Cyrus cylinder, and that's about King Cyrus, who conquered Babylon in around 538 or 539. Mm-hmm. In that, he describes himself just in the same way. It's, I'm so awesome. I'm the king now. I rule all, to all corners of the earth. That's what he said. He didn't rule all corners of the earth, but he said that. And so I'm just pointing that out because it's interesting because he was actually considered one of the better ones by the Persians. And a lot of the Persians today, a lot of Iranians and I guess people celebrate Cyrus.
Yeah, and of course, in a lot of ways, he was too. There was a lot of Cyrus had the kind of foresight, I think, of understanding that there really was no point in just brutalizing people. It was much better to have them love you, and I think a lot of the people he conquered did. You can clearly see that reflected in the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's twofold way of looking at that from a believer's perspective. Obviously, he's prophesied. But even if you weren't taking a believer's perspective, you'd still have to come to the conclusion that the Jewish people were very fond of this ruler,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he let them go back and rebuild their temple.
Right. Which is, I mean, quite an awesome thing, all things considered, right? It's so out of the ordinary for conquering nations. And, in a lot of ways, because it almost seems so counterintuitive, right? Like you're on one end, you're conquering because of precisely what I was just talking about, right? Because it's just this huge ego trip. And yet on the other end, you're not actually, you're not forcing people to be Persian, and you're not forcing people to, in fact, I mean, it almost seems like the only thing he's interested in is soldiers and taxes. You know what I mean? And I don't know. It is an interesting thing, all things considered.
Yeah, no, I like that whole story surrounding that. I actually love the book of Daniel. That's one of my favorite books, but the whole story surrounding it is super just interesting. The Belshazzar thing and how the writing on the wall with the hand, your days, you've been judged in the balances and found wanting. Your days are over.
Yeah. That's the Cyrus is that the first potential or proposed decree? I mean, prophecy, right? Some people hold that that's the first option, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of them. So there are 4, and the last one ended in around 444 BC.
Right. There's like 4, right? There's about 4 of them. I take the 457 of Artaxerxes. I don't know.
Yeah, I see that. Jews for Jesus take the 444 one. I think they're all. I mean, it's whatever it is. No matter which one you take, we have a time for Jesus to come, and Jesus came. And so I don't know how the Jewish people. Well, actually, I do know what they do. They've de-propheted him. He was considered a prophet by people like Josephus, but Jewish people today have removed him from being a prophet.
Yeah, but John the Baptist too, actually, probably for the same reason, honestly.
Oh yeah, good point. That's true. There's something I've heard in one of the non-canonical Jewish books about like a curse on people who try to figure that out or whatever. But you're right. I think the time period, whatever it is, I obviously have my view, but it is the general timeline. I think I like the way Michael Brown tends to deal with it when he speaks about it in context of answering the critics of Jesus being the Messiah. He says he'll just say, well, we know that the Messiah had to come before the second temple was destroyed, and so that covers any of the dates you may want to start your timeline on.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I gotta head out. Enjoy the nice weather that we have over here. But it was a pleasure talking with you, Synagogue, and nice seeing you again, Stephanie. Nice talking with you, Jamie. But you guys have a good Saturday.
Yeah,
you have a great Saturday
as well. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it was fun.
So I do want to let everyone know, and obviously there's nothing wrong with anything right now, but we will have to start winding down by 30 minutes from now, with hard stop 40 minutes from now. That still gives us plenty of room for conversation, but just want to make sure everyone knows so we're not catching anybody off guard. But with that, returning back to the conversation.
Yeah, cool. That's I think I like these open rooms, and I don't think I've been on your open rooms before, so I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The open rooms are they're a double-edged sword in a way, because on one end they're almost the only videos of mine that get dislikes. A lot of times, like when I do these interviews or even just my own opinions and commentaries and podcasts and stuff, I tend to get nothing but likes, and it's just a matter of a lot versus a little. These open rooms tend to attract people who, for whatever reason, do want to hit that dislike button. So that obviously isn't very cool. And sometimes they can totally turn into just firestorms, and I'm not the best at moderating quite yet, so I can kind of not control that sometimes. But on the flip side, You get a lot of really good conversation, and they are one of the most viewed videos that I put up, which honestly probably explains the dislikes because it means more people are seeing it.
Yeah, I always get dislikes. I get dislikes even before I start the video.
That means you got to be doing something right, I guess, though, right?
Yeah. I think that I like the idea of I liked your, actually I watched, it's interesting because there's this is bringing up another video that you just did, but was it James Roll?
David Roll.
David Roll, Patterns of Evidence guy, because that went against the other guy that I just saw. And so there's all these different proposed dates around Moses. So what did you think was David Roll's most compelling argument for the earlier dating?
So most compelling, that's a good question, actually. I would say now, just to briefly clarify for everyone, I actually I'm fully on board with David Roll. So I buy the new chronology. I say hook, line, and sinker just to sort of, be tongue in cheek about it. But so that just to use that as a caveat. I would say I'd have to use probably a couple, and I will narrow it down only to two, just so I don't rant. So the first one that I think is incredibly convincing is the slave list papyrus, because it isn't just Semitic names, but biblical Hebrew names in the slave list, and they're 300 years too early, at least according to the conventional chronology, right? But it's it's Jacob, it's Asher, it's Eov, which is Job, right? I mean, these are explicitly biblically Hebrew names, right?
Yeah, definitely. Things like that.
Manasseh, right? Even one of them. I think Ephraim was also one of them. And the point just being that, like, in my opinion, that is near irrefutable evidence. Unless you could find, the only way I think you could refute it, and this would be just like a huge fluke, I think, but if you could find a civilization that actually spoke the exact same language and happened to have the exact same legend, but didn't turn out to be the Israelites, which I almost think people would be willing to buy that with how much they're trying to disprove the scriptures. But that, in my opinion, is a huge piece of evidence. And then also the tomb, I think, the Joseph tomb.
Yeah, I saw that on Patterns.
Yeah. That in my opinion, that's actually the first thing I ever saw from David Roll before Patterns of Evidence even came out. And that, in my opinion, that is another one that's like, it's almost irrefutable. Because taking away from all the awesome stuff about the site itself, just looking at that tomb, we have somebody who is in the time that would work according to the new chronology, doing the things that are allegedly being done by this Joseph character, Semitic, having some of the similar qualities of Joseph, like having the multicolored coat, and being defaced, which is important because Joseph would be defaced at some point, because if people remembered him at all, there would come a point in time where he was associated with the Exodus, and that would obviously cause people to dislike him. And that's assuming that he wasn't already, defaced by the Pharaoh who did not know him, which is more likely, as people have pointed out, the word know doesn't necessarily always convey knowledge per se in the Bible. A lot of times it conveys like intimacy, which could mean like he just did not care. He had no relation. David Roll actually points out that if the southern, as what happens in his chronology, if the southern kings came up and took over the whole kingdom, then that would be exactly the case. They just wouldn't have any sort of a care because he worked for the other guys. But nonetheless, I think those are the two big ones, the Joseph tomb and the slave list. But I think there's other good arguments as well.
Yeah, no, I liked his argument on Joseph tomb. And there's the other one that I think is compelling, and I just found this in the Bible. And Susan's making a good point on mene, tekel, uparshin, I think are the words, what they actually mean, numbered, weighed, and divided. But the thing right here, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of of Ziv. And so there's a very specific time that the later daters actually have to sort of invent a means to explain that, because it works out to the earlier dating.
Yeah, and it's funny, their explanation is I hope to have Dr. David Falk on here, because he's a evangelical Christian who is a late dater.
Yeah, I like him.
I won't be like directly, like I'll ask him some questions at the end, but the intention is to have an interview. So I actually want him to lay out his case, not necessarily refute it. But just to lay out one of the reasons why I don't believe the case. So they'll often say this is an idealized figure. The idea being 12 times 40. So what they're trying to say is that it's 12 generations, and 40 is an idealized figure. So 12 times 40 is 480. And that's what it actually, what they're trying to convey. But what it actually probably is closer to 12 times 25, which is roughly 300 years. And that gets you in about 1265 BC, Ramses II era, by conventional chronology, of course, because Falk would also by conventional chronology. The example they usually use to justify this is the 720 years between the restoration of the Temple of Ishtar and its building. And I find that to be a very interesting example, because that's actually circular in that there is no proof that figure is an idealized number. In fact, at bare minimum, we do know that 700 years separate the reign, and I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but 700 years do separate the reign of the king who restores the Temple of Ishtar and the king who builds the Temple of Ishtar. So, in other words, the evidence is leaning more towards this not being an idealized figure either, which is interesting, because this is the evidence they use to suggest that the 480 years is an idealized figure. And of course, even more interesting than that is some might say, okay, but it doesn't look like it's exactly 720 years. Okay, right. But if that's true, because I don't think it actually is, to be fair, but if that's true, it's only 20 years off. You know what I mean? It's not 180 years off. And so I kind of find that to be a very weird not misinterpretation, but just like trying to, you have to force the text to mistranslate, I think, in order to make that argument. And I don't buy it. I think the idealized numbers thing is something that scholars have made up to try and fit their preconceived theories, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, well, he did point out some really interesting things that I'd never even thought about. But one of the things is when people were talking about, and this could be whichever time period you pick, this kind of thing. If they say, well, why don't we have clothing left? Why don't we have any garments of clothing or some sort of evidence that can be found if they were wandering around in the wilderness for the 40 years? Why don't we have that kind of stuff? And he pointed out something really important that you never really think about. And it's, why did these people divide up Jesus's clothes? I mean, these are the clothes would have been dirty and covered in blood. Why would they want them so much? And he said the value of clothing was just incredibly high, because it was so rare to have things made up like that. So people wouldn't just leave a jacket around or something like that, because it's extremely valued.
Yeah, and on top of that too, I think one of the important things to note with the wandering is, it's actually somewhat unreasonable to expect evidence of the wandering. If you found any evidence of the wandering, in my opinion, it would be the Jordan Valley military campaign, or the Midianite military campaign, or the Amalekite military campaign, because wars do tend to leave evidence, and sometimes we're lucky enough to find that evidence. But the wandering itself, I mean, you're talking about a short period of time. It's only 40 years. And you're talking about a tribal group that is primitive, and you're talking about a nomadic group, and you're talking about an intensely hostile environment. And to give an example where a lot of those things aren't the case, the Iroquois tribe, for example, right? So the Iroquois tribe don't live in this desert-like environment. They live in eastern New York. And I think they would be kind of in Pennsylvania area as well. And by the way, that's the Iroquois Confederation. It's multiple tribes, but nonetheless, the Iroquois people, right? So much higher likelihood of having preservation as far as the natural resources are concerned, because you're not in the desert anymore, right? Also, not 3,000 years ago, but right now. Also, not for 40 years, but for hundreds of years. Also, not actually nomadic. They stayed in the same place. And we have little to no evidence whatsoever of the Iroquois tribe's existence other than the fact that we actually met them. You know what I mean? And they have legends and stuff like that. But as far as archaeologically speaking, it's almost nothing. And it's because they were tribal, primitive kinds of people. And they don't even have all of those asterisks that you have to add to the Israelites, which is they're in Arabia, right? It's only for 4 decades. It's a very long time ago. And like I said, I think at best what you could expect is you might find evidence that they had the military altercations, but I don't think you could expect anything else.
Yeah, it's like one of those things that there was another thing that he pointed out too, that David Falk David, is it David Falk?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So there's 2 Davids, David Roll and David Falk. There's another thing that he pointed out that I thought was interesting is when they number the number of Israelites, he said, and I didn't realize this, the Hebrew word that you use, I don't remember if it's 1,000 or million or whatever it was, but the Hebrew word that's used can also mean some other word that I think was groups or something like that. And so it just made sense that you can explain some of the numbers from that. So I have to look it up and get exactly what he said on that because I'm forgetting.
And I have heard some people note, I think the Hebrew word for 1,000, if I'm not mistaken, can also be translated clan.
Yeah, that's it. That was it. That was what it was.
And if that's the case, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, honestly. I do have questions about population just because it does seem to me like the ancients are pretty consistent about talking about thousands and millions and stuff like that. And we just sort of dismiss them. And I wonder about that. Like, I'm sure there's a decent argument to say for that, but it is weird to me, how the Persians showed up with 1 million according to the Greeks, and we left with 600,000 according to ourselves, and the Akhmose campaign brought in, or excuse me, not Akhmose, Amenhotep II campaign into Syria brought 100,000 people as war booty and stuff like that, and everybody says, well, these are all exaggerated. And it's like, so every number is exaggerated? I mean, but at the same time, it could be. Maybe every number is exaggerated. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, well, just like, so if we look at it this way, now that you reminded me what it was, thank you very much. So if you say 600 blank and we translate it as 600,000 versus 600 clans, I think that I really like that argument on the 600 clans, to be honest.
Yeah. And I'm definitely not opposed to it too. I could certainly see it happening. I guess my only thing is just to say that I'm not opposed to the 600,000 either. Although I do tend to grant the 600,000 being an exaggeration when it comes to historicity arguments, just because I don't think it's relevant.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Hyperbole.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's one of those things where it's like, I always use the Thermopylae example because it's a perfect example. Everybody accepts that it happened, and we all accept that Leonidas led 300 Spartans there, as well as 7,000 total Greeks. And we all accept that the Persians ended up winning after a last stand of people, and that Xerxes is the one who called the invasion, and the whole thing, the whole story. We buy the whole thing, right? Except for one detail, and that is that we don't think that 1 million Persians showed up. We typically say it's probably somewhere between 1 and 300,000, because 1 million Persians seems like a ridiculous number, right? The point being that, all right, fine. So I can grant the 600,000 is not actually the accurate. It could be hyperbole, whatever. That's fine. That has no bearing whatsoever on the rest of the story, as proven by the Battle of Thermopylae.
I can say one thing. If the I know it's not popular among the academics or whatever, but if the Exodus the site is in Saudi Arabia, I wonder if I saw a thing that Joel Richardson presented where they're warned about not coming near the mountain when Moses was talking to God or whatever. I think they came across some petroglyphs like around the other side of the mountain, which showed similar ones to what they consider to be where they drew the Egyptian style Horus, or like cow, where they think the golden calf site was, which is kind of interesting too, because they found like probably the oldest depiction of a menorah and ancient Hebrew writing on these rocks. But I don't know if he found it when they were over there, but it seemed like it was something I hadn't heard of before about this site. But they found like graves of several thousand graves within a mile of that place where there was warning, where they found the petroglyphs of like little people like with bow and arrows, because I think that's what the text even says. They're gonna like sharpshoot them or whatever, but they found like what would be the appropriate distance away from where they would have been camping, and like there's like you know, because they bury the dead or whatever, I guess. So I mean, you got to look at some of the evidence. I know nobody believes that that's it, that's in academia, but it's so overwhelming and it fits the biblical narrative so precisely. My point was just going to be that if that indeed were the site, I think I would suspect you'd have to assume the given numbers as written in English anyways, for that many people to be buried or whatever, perhaps. I don't know. I'd have to consider that more. But I know that with that idea and the proposed crossing site, like that beach or whatever, Nueva Beach, could house 600,000 men and women and children. And it also is a good candidate because if you look on Google Earth and you look at the eastern finger of that part of the Red Sea, and you zoom in on it, I think they call them wadis, but there's like a path through the mountains, and it says in the text like they were entrapped by the wilderness, and then it describes them camping on the beach and feeling like they were stuck, and it talks about the pillar of cloud, you know, and blocking the Egyptian army, which would make perfect sense because it's like the wadi is like through this canyon, and then it opens up to a large, huge beach. And so like a pillar of cloud or whatever could potentially block them in that wadi while the Israelites are on the beach. And they did apparently find what looked like pillars on either side of that place that had Phoenician style writings that mentioned Solomon, like maybe he was marking that as a commemorative thing. And you used to be able to see the pillar even from Google Earth because you could see the shadow. The Israelis apparently like put it in a like cement or whatever. Anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I'm kind of, I consider myself sort of agnostic on the Moses dating because I just don't know enough about it. I'm very interested in it though. I'm trying to learn more and listen more and that sort of thing because it's fascinating. And it goes against the one thing that I noticed that's going on that I think has also been pointed out by others, and maybe even David Roll pointed this out, but people pick these dates, like a hypothesis will come up and they'll say, okay, let's hypothesize the date that this thing occurred. And then a lot of other academics will anchor their dates off of that date. And what happens if the date you picked is incorrect?
See, and that's one of the reasons why I actually take such a fundamentalist view of the chronology as far as the Bible's concerned, is because it's really one of the most sure ones that we have. You know what I mean? As far as, because we know within a year when Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. It was either 587 or 586, and we can get that down very solid, right? And when you have something like that, and then you can count the chronology backwards, right? And maybe you have to account for some co-regency or something like that. But once you figured out the chronology of these kings of Judah and United Kingdom of Israel, right? And then that 480 years from the fourth year of Solomon, you have effectively, because of how detailed the Bible is, combined with the surety of that conquest date, really the best of the BC chronologies that we even have, at least maybe outside of Assyria. I guess Assyria's is pretty solid. But you know, and to dismiss that, in my opinion, is pretty out there, I would think, in favor for something like Egypt or Greece or Canaan or anything like that, which is just floating around, frankly. Now, it is interesting. I don't agree with everything David Roll says. I think that I agree with virtually everything he says, but there are a couple areas of disagreement. The main one actually being, I do believe that Mount Sinai is in what would today be Saudi Arabia. I think that but now he did point out some things that I think are interesting, and they may change. I'm not sure if I still take the same view on the crossing site today that I did 2 weeks ago on the basis of some of the stuff that he said. It was interesting, but I also had some issues, so I'm kind of going back and forth with it. But as far as the mountain itself, it does seem to me that the Desert of Shur is not definitively linked to the Sinai Peninsula. And even if it were linked to the Sinai Peninsula, it might not be explicitly that area in the Sinai Peninsula, but might also be still the area that would be considered Midian. And it does still seem to me like elsewhere there is good evidence to support the idea of it being in Midian, namely that Moses was in Midian, and also that the Israelites, when they left, go to meet Jethro, who's also obviously in Midian. And of course, the big one being that Paul said that Mount Sinai was in Arabia. And we know what Paul means by Arabia because he went to Damascus and called that Arabia. So Damascus is the, obviously in modern day Syria. So what he's got to be talking about is that region that we would consider would be Syria, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think those are pretty solid indicators, in my opinion, that and Josephus also, by the way, does tell us that that Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, he's in the word Saudi Arabia, but you know what I mean.
I think people are funny about Josephus because they'll pick Josephus over the Bible any day, but then they pick and choose which Josephus to use, and sometimes they'll admit that Josephus has been wrong on a couple of things, and so
yeah, it seems to be motivated by a bias a lot of the time. Anyways, I would hate to paint anybody particular, but yeah,
for example. Let me give an example. So Daniel, there's the big argument on when Daniel was written. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that it was written during the time when all of the Babylonian stuff occurred, around 530 BC, or somewhere in that neighborhood between the time that he came in around 605 to about 530. Now, people will say, well, Josephus counts for certain things, but then they'll say, but we're not going to pay attention to the fact that Josephus pointed out that that the book of Daniel was opened up to Alexander the Great, which would have occurred around 332 BC. And so they'll ignore that thing that Josephus said because they want to pretend that the book of Daniel was written in 165 BC instead of when it was really written, and instead of actually what Daniel said about himself writing the book. And so the same people who will do that. And then there's another thing that they do. There's something called Schur's hypothesis. And Schur, Schurer, came up with this idea that that King Herod, the King Herod who was around when Jesus was born, died in 4 BC, okay, because of something Josephus said. So Josephus said there was an eclipse just before when King Herod died. Now, there happened to also be an eclipse in 1 BC. And so now there's some people like Steinman who've gotten up and said, wait a second, there's a bigger eclipse occurred in 1 BC. And Herod also said that that King Herod did a number of things between the time of the Passover, or the eclipse and the Passover. And so during 4 BC, it was a very small window of time between the eclipse and the Passover. And Steinman realized that there's no way that Herod could have accomplished all the stuff in 4 BC. So he had to have died in 1 BC. But you wouldn't believe the massive number of people still endorsing the 4 BC because it kind of screws up Jesus's timeline.
Well, and what's interesting too is this has been a really a recurrent theme in academia throughout history. And, I know that there are certain folk out there who really hate that I bring this up. Like Dr. Josh Bowen, for example. But the thing is,
thinking of.
he knows I'm right. He's even admitted to me that I'm right. Right. There was a time when everybody said the Hittites didn't exist and the Bible made it up. And then we found them. And then Nineveh didn't exist. And then we found it. And then the Philistines didn't exist. And then we found them. And then the Canaanites didn't exist. And then we found them. And then Jesus didn't, you know what I mean? And it was like,
yeah.
Exactly. And it gets to a point, it's like, okay, so you guys you're just looking for something is what's going on here. And that's why now I'm actually, I don't know if I told you, SJ, I'm actually in the process now of writing a book on the historicity of Moses, which will probably not be done for quite some time because I am planning on going just all into it. Mm-hmm. I might even send it in for a peer review if I'm lucky enough to get them to listen to me. But so it's going to be like something like 500 or 600 pages. But I think if we start to address these issues that people are like scared of, like Daniel, like Moses, like the conquest, it's like, okay, they fell apart everywhere else. So let's go after these areas as well, because they inevitably will fall apart. I think we'll find the evidence. And David Roll is, I think, a perfect example of us starting to find that evidence. Obviously, some people are going to need to tweak his chronology because that's just the way that history works, right? Nobody ever gets the perfect thing. But the amount of evidence he presents, in my opinion, is overwhelming. And the problems people posit for him are very often non-problems. I think the Philistine one is really great because, well, the Philistines, the David roll chronology makes the Philistines not show up until 878, but Moses mentions them in 1450. And it's like, okay, but your chronology says that the Philistines showed up in 1178 and Moses mentions them in 1450. So I don't understand how you think you're solving the problem here. And if the problem exists for both of us, then maybe there's an outside problem, which David Roll and I would agree on, actually. Not that my opinion matters. He's the expert here. But that the Philistines showing up in 1178 is just wrong. That's not true, right? The Philistine, the word Philistine, which is actually a luphaloi, and eventually became Peliset, right? It's just a general term to describe Indo-European foreigners who lived in the Gaza region. It's not necessarily the culture that is what eventually became the Peliset. It's the ancestors of them, but it's kind of like how, the Israelites didn't come out of Egypt because they weren't Israelites yet, right? They were Hebrews. Likewise, it wasn't you wouldn't even, I don't know if you would even go as far as to call Abraham a Hebrew. You might, I guess, but I would think maybe it'd be the descendants of him who would be considered to be Hebrews, right? The point being that like they could be the descendants or the progenitors of the Philistines for sure. But we know there were Indo-Europeans before the establishment of this culture that was called Peliset. So the idea that Peliset showed up in 1178 or that the Philistines showed up in 1178, it's just wrong, right? And that's shown, I think, in the fact that even though people would like to throw that at the new chronology, it ends up being just as bad if you throw it right back at them.
That, and you're reminding me, that's what you started off with there, especially on what you say about academics. I've seen it myself in the scholarly literature in my field, where somebody will say something like, there was a big controversy that happened a few years ago, actually probably about 20 years ago, and this person exposed it. Everybody was talking about expatriate failure rates. And one person started saying, well, expatriates fail around 25%. And they found out, and then other people were jumping onto, by citing that person who didn't have any backing. The person had no backing for the 25%. And suddenly everyone's referencing that as if it's true. And then it turns out it wasn't true. And this woman called it out. She's like, look at everyone's jumping on this bandwagon. And this first assertion was never actually backed. And so that's the same thing. What they want to do, and I think that there's a sinister sort of thing here, is they'll say, okay, let's just put something out there like the documentary hypothesis, right? And then suddenly people are coming up and saying, oh, that must be true. The Pentateuch must have been written by a number of different authors over a long period of time, rather than what Jesus said, that Moses wrote those books.
Yeah, and I even, and I actually find that there is an interesting way to explain some of the problems with the Pentateuch thing too. Because I do believe that Moses wrote the Torah, but I also do think there was probably a redactor. The thing is, though, I think I could even go as far as to say I know who that redactor was. And so let me just break down my reason why, right? So there is as far back as you can go, tradition indicates that Moses wrote the Torah, which in my opinion is very solid evidence that he did. There are small things, though, that he probably didn't write just based off of logically, right? Like the first one being his death. The second one being the notion that a prophet like unto him hadn't shown up yet, because obviously that would imply him already being dead. And then the third one is just small editorial details, like the name Ramses and P. Ramses, or referring to Egypt as the land of Ramses, right? And so the additions, I think you can easily explain with Joshua, because the book of Joshua actually claims that Joshua wrote in the book of the law. So I think that's where you get, and Moses was a meek man, or the death of Moses, and no prophet has shown up like unto Moses. Those are probably all Joshua's words, right? And
that's reasonable.
Right, exactly, right? Because it seems to me like that should be one that we all kind of accept on the basis that if the book of the law is the Torah, which I believe it is, Joshua, the book of Joshua, does say Joshua wrote in that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's probably what he wrote. It would be those details. And then I think the editorial details, like calling things Ramses instead of Avaris, and stuff like that. My theory is that was probably done by Samuel. And so let me kind of explain why. So if the new chronology is correct, then you would have Ramses existing, the city, I mean, as late as 800 BC when Shoshenq would try to revive it. And if the old chronology is correct, it would be as early as 1300. So that gives us a wide 500-year range when the term Ramses will be used to describe this area. But that whole 500 years can't be true, right? Because one of those chronologies has to be wrong. They can't both be true at the same time. But it just allow us to see that range on a biblical platform, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you look over that range. A large portion of that time is the Judges period, very tribalistic, not very educated, not going to be any sort of redactions. In fact, there's no books seemingly written in this time. The book of the Judges itself, according to tradition, is written by Samuel. Ruth, also written by Samuel. And Samuel, also written by Samuel, right? And these are all according, like I said, to the traditions. So we don't get anybody who in this period seems like they can write until about the time of Samuel in the 1000s, right? 1000s. And I mean that as in like strictly speaking. So before the 1100s or after, I guess, because we're talking BCs. Anyways. So then what about the last 200 years of that though, after 1000? Well, you could have David. I don't think David would be personally doing the redactions himself, just based on the fact that might cause people to start questioning things if the king starts redacting the Bible, right? That people could start getting the wrong idea. And I think David would probably be wise enough to understand that. And I think God would be wise enough to understand that also, because I think whoever did this did so under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, right? Which is why it has to be one of these named figures also, just for the record. And who do we have after that? Maybe Solomon, also for the same reason. I don't think that would work. Maybe some of the prophets, but Elijah's never said to write anything. Isaiah's too late. Ezra's too late. Amos is too late. Hosea's too late. Well, so on and so forth, right? So really, you're actually left with one person, and that is Samuel. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of traditions around Samuel. He's said to have founded a school where they taught, the word they use is prophets, but really messengers is the idea, right? He is said to have been a brilliant mind, multilingual by the rabbis. There's a lot of tradition in the Seder Olam and so on that talks about him being a very, very brilliant person. He was a priest, which means he would be getting the best education that could be provided in Israel, at least, and so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, the rabbis do have a tradition of him not being the prophet like unto Moses, but a prophet who is incredibly similar to Moses. One of the main indications of it being that it does seem like, while God doesn't speak to him in quite the face-to-face manner he does with Moses, he doesn't speak to him in dreams or visions like he does with Isaiah, Daniel, and etc. Samuel almost occupies a middle position between those two. And so I think on the basis of those things that Samuel probably did the redactions, because it can't be after that, right? Isaiah wouldn't be calling the region Ramses. And Isaiah, in fact, wouldn't be calling the region anything because it would be gone at that point, which is why it remains Ramses and isn't changed to something else later on, right? It'd be kind of like if we change the name of New Amsterdam to New York and we updated text to say New York instead of New Amsterdam, but then New York is destroyed. Well, we're not going to update the text to say something else because New York is the last thing that it was.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my very long way of saying I think that Moses wrote the Torah, Joshua made some small additions, and Samuel probably redacted it to make it make a little bit more sense to the people who were reading it.
That's interesting. Yeah, that seems reasonable. We know Samuel had a book. It's 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, so we know he had books, I should say. You're bringing up, you just reminded me of something that I want to bring up really quickly in case people haven't looked into this. I love the fact that Isaiah named Cyrus as the person who was going to bring down King Nebuchadnezzar, dozens of years before that happened. I love the fact that Isaiah did that. He named Cyrus, and that's pretty amazing. I love the fact that Jeremiah pointed out that the Jews were going to be in exile for 70 years, and they were. It's just,
right.
They were coming out of exile starting around the time when Cyrus got into office. They were coming out of exile, just as Jeremiah said. And so there's some really cool prophecies in the Old Testament that I think people should look into. And the reason why the Jewish people considered people prophets is if something had come true that they had foretold in the lifetime of the prophet, and then also years later.
Yeah, and what's interesting about a lot of it too is the fact that the Jews have such an insanely high standard for prophets that it almost makes it difficult to believe when people say that such and such a person wasn't actually a prophetic or something like that. My favorite example, just because I debated the Tyre thing with Raging Atheist, and also Dr. Josh Bowen is very big on the Tyre prophecy being false, as is Aaron Ra. They say Ezekiel even acknowledged that it was wrong and gave such and such a prophecy. And it's like, hang on, full stop. You ever read Deuteronomy before, my friend? If Ezekiel admitted that it was wrong, the Jews would have been like, okay. And to quote the Jews from another instance, what further need have we of witnesses? You know what I mean? And then they would stone him to death. So clearly that is not what he's saying here. And based off of that standard, I think it's reasonable to trust a lot of these guys. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're just bringing up something really good. Mike Winger made a really good video on this on Tyre. Have you seen that?
I have, actually.
Yeah, and he totally looked at Aaron Ra's video and it explained it exactly why it was wrong in so many ways. And Aaron Ra still goes out there and says this kind of stuff, and so do all these other atheists. They won't take the way that he was completely debunked.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that, and there's even some theories I have about that too. I do notice it's 39, so I'm gonna have to start winding this down so I can go to work.
That's right.
That's all right. I actually totally lied. I was supposed to warn everybody again at 30, and I didn't, so my apologies. But I just wanted to point out really quick. I do have a theory that is right now. It's only a hypothesis, obviously, but. I wonder. I think Nebuchadnezzar might have done a little bit more than we think he did. I do still think Alexander ends up being the ultimate fruition of the prophecy. But it is interesting that when Alexander showed up, they called it New Tyre. And everybody says, no, Nebuchadnezzar didn't destroy it. And to me, I don't think they call it New Tyre if Nebuchadnezzar doesn't destroy it. And the only evidence, so the evidence we have, right, that he didn't destroy it is the prophecy where Ezekiel admits he's wrong, which as I just explained, I don't think that's at all what Ezekiel is saying. And there is the continuation of Tyre afterwards, right? We do have another record that does show at least that Nebuchadnezzar won the battle because he has a bunch of prisoners, 126, I think, to be exact. So I think if you put the pieces together, what we have is an absence of evidence, not anything more, right? It does seem Nebuchadnezzar won the battle, and also that they were calling the area New Tyre, and also that the Jews felt that Ezekiel was telling the truth. That seems to me to indicate that he did a lot more damage than we give credit for, even if the city was maybe rebuilt. You know what I mean? But with that, I guess I do have to somewhat abruptly start winding down, but I do want everybody to get a final say as to what they've all wanted to, chime in and all that kind of stuff. So go right ahead and have final says. And by the way, I appreciate both you guys and everybody else who also was here and everybody else who watched as well.
Great. Jamie, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Nice to see you, SJ, and good to talk to you guys both. I'm going to be debating Soul Sleep on the 23rd on SFT's channel. So if you're interested in that subject, you should come watch it. And I am working on that thing for you, buddy. And hopefully I'll be done soon. I'm having trouble a little bit, but I'll get it to you right away as fast as I can. And have a good day.
Yeah, so I'm not really working on anything in particular, but I am still working on this book that I've been working on now for over a year. So I'm working on that, and I just added a bunch of prophecies to a section, which is why some of that stuff I brought up today is actually in that book. So that's what I'm working on. So thank you so much. It's great to see you guys.
Absolutely, and it's great to see you as well. And thank you both for showing up. And actually, so the 23rd is going to be a pretty interesting day. I wonder if we could potentially convince some move around a little bit, because the 23rd is also the day that Jim Majors and Josh Bowen
Yes,
will
the
be
Book of
debating-
Daniel.
Yeah, with Jonathan Sheffield, and I can't remember the other one who's with Sheffield, but I know that the atheist community here is a real big fan of Josh Bowen. I think Josh Bowen's a cool guy, but I'm not a huge fan of his scholarship. I'll be honest with you. That's obviously due to my bias, the fact that he's an atheist. I'm not. So everybody take that with the salt mine that it needs to come with. But and
it's on the Book of Daniel.
Yeah, and I think that'll be a really good conversation too. I wonder if I'm gonna have to talk to. Man, that stinks because I just looked it up and it's 6 p.m. and Jamie Russell and Nephilim Free will be debating Soul Sleep on 6:30. So those are going to be at the same time. That's
rough.
Yeah,
I have to watch the Book of Daniel because I'm going to have to be putting in my 2 cents.
Yeah, because that's part of what your book is about, right? Is Daniel?
I've got some on there. Yeah, I've definitely got some Daniel in there, but the Daniel thing fires me up. So I hope I can stay normal in the chat.
So, well, absolutely. I mean, I think definitely. I've never actually seen any sort of SJ acting out, so I think that'll be fine. But with that, let me say. So I got a couple announcements I want to end with, and then we'll go ahead and get this done. So once again, I want to remind you guys of 2 things that happened in the past. Number 1, had an interview with Chris Date. That's my episode number 91 on the subject of annihilationism. That was a fantastic conversation, in my opinion. We take slightly different opinions as far as the annihilation is concerned. Me believing in a torment followed by annihilation, and him believing in physicalism. But nonetheless, our reasons for believing in the annihilation and conditional immortality part are very similar, and it was a great conversation betwixt the 2 of us. I think you guys will definitely enjoy it if you haven't checked it out already. Also, the David Roll interview, definitely check that out. That was absolutely fantastic as well. That might be the best thing that this channel has ever done. A little bit biased towards that because I love the Moses conversation, but that was a great conversation. David Roll is a brilliant man. And we went for a solid 3 hours on that. And he was very courteous with us too. Even provided some visuals and stuff like that. So definitely check that one out also if you have not. And then to remind you guys of the future. So on the 22nd of this month, 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time, I will be interviewing Bruce Gore, church historian Bruce Gore. He's famous here on YouTube with his, he's got about 30,000 subscribers. He's going to be providing for us the case for a conventional chronology. Exodus, so 1446 on the conventional chronology as opposed to the new chronology that David Roll has. Not in direct debate, just simply presenting the case. And we are currently in talks with Matt Slick and Douglas Petrovich as well as David Falk. None of that is set in stone, but we may potentially get all of that happening. The one that's most likely to happen so far is definitely the one with Petrovich, because Petrovich has definitely indicated he's interested. But we might also have Dr. David Falk and Matt Slick as well. So definitely look forward to that. Slam, that SJ actually just shared the last name there. That is Falk Falk. He takes a early date or a late date rather. So that Ramses was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? And then I also want to remind you guys, I'll be debating Rob Rowe of Sentinel Apologetics.
Oh, really?
The Gospel Truth. Yeah, it'll actually be my first time being on the Gospel Truth. Second time talking with Rob one-on-one. We talked, actually, for those of you who are interested, me and him did have a conversation in my episode number 90, actually, about our different, understandings of the Bible and how it is meant to be understood. That was also a pretty good conversation as well, if you guys are interested. But we'll be debating, actually, whether or not the flood was global, which is my position, or local, which is his position, specifically the Persian Gulf flood theory. And that'll be July 1st. So a little bit farther down the line. But nonetheless, hopefully you guys will be entertained by that one as well and get some good knowledge from it, of course, because entertainment is one thing, but we really want to be here in pursuit of truth.
Agreed.
And I appreciate that, by the way. I think that's about it. Oh, yeah. And of course, since I'm writing it now, I do have to try and get people somewhat excited, even if it does take me a long time to finish it. I am writing a book on the historicity of Moses, actually. I don't know if anybody cares about that or thinks my opinions are worth anything, but we're gonna see how that works out. I'm gonna try and go as deep dive in it as I possibly can. It's going to be super academic and therefore probably not something that will, even if it does end up being successful, not something that would ever be like a New York Times bestseller or anything like that. I'm planning on doing it, modeling it after things like On the Historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier, right? In that it's like no stone left unturned. We're going through absolutely every single piece of evidence that we can find that potentially supports our theory, right? By the way, I just got confirmation in the live chat. It says that Jamie Russell is actually going to switch that debate to the 24th. So we'll actually be able to get both of those.
What was the name of the channel that Jamie Russell's going to be on again?
Standing for Truth. Actually.
Okay. I'll make sure I got that lined up.
And then, so I'm calling the book on Moses's history. And we're going to, hopefully get that produced here in a quick time and, get everybody excited for that. So thank you all for showing up. Definitely like and share this video if you liked this video. Subscribe if you think this content is good. Also, be sure to check out my political channel if you're interested in my politics and political podcast. That is the Synagogue News, just the Synagogue, one word, space, news. And that's where I'm going to start posting Watchdog podcasts starting this Monday. And then also, if you guys are interested in supporting me on any sort of Patreon or anything like that, you can go to my Patreon there. I actually have that in the live chat. And you can go to Patreon/The Synagogue if you're just interested in going there. Also, I do have numerous social media accounts that you guys can find me on. Minds, Parler, Gab, BitChute, and Rumble. As far as my new stuff is concerned, those will start being posted on Monday as well. And Facebook and all that, Twitter, right? So at any place you can find me, you'll be able to find me with the tag The Synagogue. My display name will very often be different, but Synagogue, you'll be able to find me. And that is about everything, actually. So shalom. God bless you.
Shalom.
And if the Lord tarries, we'll see you again soon.
Sounds good. Have a good one, everyone.